Hey, what's up? This is Scott with Level Up Tutorials, and in this video, we're going to get started with some of the basic building blocks of any design or vector design application. We're going to be talking about shapes. So I'm going to show you basically everything there is to know about working with shapes in Figma so that you can have a nice foundation for continuing and furthering your design capabilities in this app. So let's get started now. Okay, so in this video, I'm going to be taking you through some of the basic creation in Figma. And the first thing I want to do is essentially just create a new file. If you already have a file open, it doesn't really matter what you're working in because we're really just going to be going over shapes, basic tools, that sort of stuff, right? We're still in the introduction phase of things here, so nothing too crazy. So if you already can figure out shapes and stuff on your own, please, skip ahead. However, if you'd like to see how, maybe some of the nuances or basically the creation of this sort of stuff works in Figma, continue watching and we're going to get into it. So first things first here is we have our blank canvas. Now I mentioned in the previous video that we have these things called frames, which are pretty much artboards, but we don't need them, especially we don't need them right now. And typically you're going to want to work inside of a frame, but when we're just doing these sort of shapes, we don't need to lay one out first. So if you're wondering why I'm not immediately going straight for the artboard, that's why. Okay, so we have our shape tools, which you can see you get a couple of different tooltips. If you hover over the down arrow, you get this thing that says shape tools, which is basically just a hint to say, hey, click on this if you want to get more shape tools. And we already went over the basic shortcuts of these, so let's go ahead and just get started. We have a rectangle, which we can make by hitting the R key or selecting rectangle here, and then we're going to want to just click and drag. And just like Illustrator, or Photoshop, or anything like that, if you hold the Shift key, it's going to make this into a regular shape. So, as you can see, I'm dragging this, the height and width are the exact same, and we're creating a square instead of a rectangle. Now, also like those other applications, if we were to hold the Option key, you'll notice it grows from the center rather than from the edge. Now, this is going to be super useful if you're creating a shape within a shape, or maybe even you're adjusting a shape, right? So let's create the shape. Now let's duplicate it. The second one I'm going to change the color on. So I'm going to go to fill and we're just going to select this color. I'll have it be blue for some reason just so we can see the difference. Now with the new shape selected, I'm going to grab the bottom corner. I'm going to hold Shift and Option and I'm going to drag it. And you'll notice you can see it's maintaining that same width and height. Now, another way we could have done this would be to simply hold Shift, do this, select both of them, and then say, hey, distribute them. I'm using the distribute tools right over here. I will be going over these, so the fact that I just clicked through these really quickly, if you aren't familiar with the distribute tools, don't worry, we're going to be talking about those as well. But the main point here is that if you want to hold Option and click and drag like this, you can see that we do in fact have this nice feature that's pretty much exists in all of this stuff. Okay, so that's basically how we want to lay out our shape. You'll notice that when we have our shape selected, it gives us its dimensions below it. That's super duper helpful for us. We also can get its dimensions in the right-hand column over here. You can see it's 314 by 314. If you'd like to maintain these locked all the time, you can select this constrain proportions right here. And now when we adjust these numbers, let's say we say 400, it's going to go up to 400. Keep in mind, if this constrain proportions is checked, you still need to hold the Shift key if you're dragging this. If you let go of the Shift key, it's not going to constrain the proportions. Okay. Now this X and Y value up top here is its position on the canvas. If we were to have a frame, it would be its position in that frame. If we were to have a component, which we'll get into more, it will be that position within its component. And these values are going to get really super useful in a way that I don't think they're necessarily as useful in other applications because the position can be relative to so many different things. Okay, so here we have our square. Let's go ahead and make an oval. So I'm going to select our shape here. I could just hit the O key or hit the ellipse tool right here, click and drag. You can see it's the same business here. I hold Shift, pops up, hold the Shift and Option, and it keeps it from the center. I just hold Option, it keeps it from the center and it's not regular. All the same goodies that you'd normally expect from basic shape creation. So we have our square, we have our circle. Let's go ahead and create another shape here. I'm going to get into the arrow tool, and the arrow tool is interesting because I never found the arrow tool to be useful at all in Sketch because it looks so ugly. So you can see here we have a line. And what does this line actually look like when we increase the weight? Now, what's cool about this line is that first off, it looks much nicer than the Sketch arrow. I'm not ragging on Sketch here. The Sketch arrow is just totally useless. This one at least just looks nice. So when we increase the weight on this one, what happens? The Sketch one completely blows up. And you'll notice this one does not completely blow up. In a way that's really nice, actually. It actually is becoming a useful arrow that we can use and scale and add fill to. And maybe you're doing some design with this thing and, pointing this one to this one. So we have our arrow. Okay, so now let's get into a line tool, which is one you'll be using a lot. Lines are used quite a bit in design, and you can see if we're not holding down the Shift key, you get full access to all of the angles. If we're holding down the Shift key, you can see it snaps to 45-degree increments. And again, if we hold the Option key, it's going to grow from the center rather than from one end. And if we hold the Shift key again, it's going to snap to those 45-degree angles. Now we have some options for the line tool. We can give it some weight. We can give it a stroke color, which is basically the color of the line here. And we can make this literally anything. You can add different things to the stroke. We'll be getting into more of this. I keep saying that, but it's really true. There's so much here, and there's going to be a lot to cover. So there's no point in covering absolutely everything right now. So as you can see, we have something special though with this shape. We have some dots right here on our stroke. And you can see we can change our cap. So our cap is going to be, if this is basically a stroke where it's bent at any given point, you can choose whether it's going to be a capped or that's going to be rounded, whether it's going to be basic miter, which is just like a pointy end. As you can see, we can give this a cap. Where we hit the select where we can say, hey, ends of this line should be round. Ends of this line should be square. Should be a arrow, which is actually really super good, right? Because this just made an arrow without having to make an arrow. But not only that, we get an arrow on both sides. It could be very useful. We also have triangle arrow, which you'll notice is a little bit different. Really cool. We can also do dashes and gaps. And we can do those by simply having a comma separated number. So we can say, with the dash being the length of the dash and the gap being the space between them. So let's say we want our spaces to be 2 pixels and our dashes to be 5 pixels. We can have 5, 2, and when we click off of here, you'll see we have our space in here. And if we grow this, it's just going to increase that space. Let me leave this as a straight line here. All right, I should say flat line here instead of on an angle. And we can just adjust this as we see fit. As you can see, all this stuff is sort of what you'd expect to have. Where it is underneath stroke ... You'll see this ... anytime that you have sort of advanced or different features on a given tool or on a given property. Some shapes have different advanced properties than others. And now that we've talked about this, let's see how it actually applies to the arrow that we already created. You'll see that we also have these ... where we basically are saying, hey, this is an advanced stroke and our cap is mixed. If we were to change it to anything, it would actually not become the same arrow it once was. However, there is actually a way to do that. Because these are all just vector points, right? And we're going to be able to update this line as well, like this. We actually have access to the vector. You'll notice when I hover over this, we have 2 squares on either end here. If I double click onto this object, you'll see those squares become circles. These circles can be selected individually as individual points. And this is something that is very common in any sort of vector-based tooling. You can see if I select the tip of the arrow with the circle and then select our ellipses, we have access to change this line arrow to a triangle arrow. So as you can see, we can modify this and we can change each individual vector point to do what we want it to do. I'm going to bring it back to a line arrow because I personally think it looks better, but as you can see here, we can modify any of our stroke individual points with these advanced settings. Okay, let's click out of that. So we have an arrow. We've created a new arrow. I'm just going to turn this back to a line. We don't need two arrows. Let's go there. Okay, we have our dotted line, we have our arrow, we have our circle. Now let's go ahead and check out our polygon tool where we can click and drag. We have a basic triangle. Now again, if we double click this, you can see we have access to all of the individual points. We can make this any kind of triangular shape we want. We could do more than that. We could modify it in all sorts of different ways with the pen tool, of which we're going to be getting in when we go over the pen tool. You'll also notice that when I have this double clicked, we have some new tools up here, including a pen, a bend tool, and a paint bucket tool. If we were to click done, it would deselect this for us. Now you'll notice that when we have this selected, it says count 3 right here, and it's pretty small. You might not be able to see it correctly on my screen here, but you'll see it on yours. And this is basically the number of points. Because this is a polygon, not necessarily a triangle tool, we can bump this up and say, hey, 4 points. Okay, we got a diamond or square. 5 points, we have a pentagon, hexagon, and so on-a-gon. Oh, that was a bad joke. Okay, so as you can see here, all the way to a dodecagon? Dodecagon? I don't know. I don't remember my geometry that well. But you can keep adding points as pretty much as you want to, as much as it makes sense. And we have a whole bunch of different polygons here. Basically anything you'd want to do from 3 upwards. Notice how we don't have those dots here on our fill, and we don't even have a stroke. Now I should point out too, this is something I keep going back to Sketch features and stuff like that. This is something that is actually very different in Sketch in a very positive way. When you create a shape in Sketch, it gives you a fill and a stroke on every single shape. And how many times in your work in Sketch have you immediately removed that stroke or immediately removed that fill or whatever? I mean, it's just an extra click to get it started. In Figma, it doesn't assume that you want a stroke for anything. So if you want an outline on any of your shapes, you want to go ahead and select this plus. Now you have a stroke. You can change the weight of it. We have our dots. Once again, we can change the cap and all sorts of stuff like that. So as you can see here, we have our triangle, and this can become any sort of polygon we'd like it to be. Okay, next up we have our star tool, which doesn't have a shortcut, just like the polygon doesn't have a shortcut. I'm assuming that's because you probably won't use these a ton. And we can click and drag, once again, shift for a regular shape. Now, with any of these things like star tools and any of these programs, you're probably used to having a count for how many star points you have. You notice it's right here. One of the things I really like about Figma is how adaptive these menus and toolbars are. So our toolbar over here has all of this information, but for each different type of shape, it changes and modifies so that basically the relevant information is there and not always hidden behind a menu. Sometimes, of course, it isn't behind the ... but that's usually for extra things like stroke and whatever. If it's sort of essential for the shape, it's going to be right here. You can see we can make this 6 point, 7 point, 8 point, 9 point, whatever star, and the radius is going to be the percentage of space inside of the star. You can see as this grows, the points get shallower and shallower up until we're at 100%, and that's pretty much a circle, right? So if we keep going down, it's going to be very, very pointy, and that should be nice. Now in addition, we also have this rounded edge, which is at 0, and if we were to round the edge, you'll notice all of our points get softer and softer by whatever radius. So this is a 10 pixel radius, and now we have sort of like a cog shape. This is like a it's sort of a soft cog, right? Like a real cog wouldn't be so soft. But as you can see here, we can adjust this radius and completely change the softness of this star. You might be wondering, does this radius exist for all of these other shapes? Well, of course it does, because we want to use a radius very frequently. We now have a rounded triangle, which looks sort of like a yield sign. We have a square, which can become a rounded edge square. You see this a ton in web design. If you're building like a card style layout or something like that, you're going to want to change this border radius, which is right up top here. So this icon with the rounded edge is your rounded edges. And lastly, we have this icon to the left of that, which is simply just the angle at which it's living currently. You probably saw this manipulating if you were rotating your shape or anything like that, or when we had our line creation. I want this to be at 0, since we're not 150 at 0, just since we're showing off the shape itself. Now the last thing we have is the Place Image tool. Now the Place Image tool can be accessed by Shift-Command-K or Shift-Control-K on PC, and what we want to do is actually cover the Place Image tool in more depth. Because working with images in Figma is really super cool. It actually affords you a lot of different freedoms that other vector applications don't. Because typically working in vector applications, you're straight vectors, right? So like having really good image tools in something like Figma is definitely a plus. So in the next video, we're going to be covering Place Image, and more specifically working with images overall, inside of shapes, outside of shapes, whatever. It's going to be really cool, and we're going to learn some really good time-saving tools. Okay, so thanks so much for watching. As always, this is Scott with Level Up Tutorials. If you have any questions or comments, leave a comment on the video or hit me up at Twitter or Facebook at Level Up Tutorials. If you would like to get this entire series, Master Figma, Become the Master of Figma, you want to head to store.leveluptutorials and purchase this entire series, or become a Level Up Pro. As a Level Up Pro, you get access to stream all of the content on the site. And there's a whole bunch of free exclusive series, and there's going to be more exclusive series every single month on all sorts of design and development topics. So as always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.